All right, so tell me why we can't resolve this case.
My client has been a long-time activist in the city of Bowie. He's been a political candidate in the city of Bowie.
A candidate?
A candidate. He's run for mayor. It's our understanding. I'm happy to talk to Mr. Levin. It's our understanding that essentially what they want to do is use this to keep him away from City Hall, which is where he conducts business, both in his capacity as a landlord, and to try to muzzle him with respect to his concerns that he has with regard to the city of Bowie's activities.
Well, that's a slippery slope. I acknowledge that.
I mean, this is not someone who simply goes to work and then comes home to Bowie, goes to bed, and then goes to work. His office is in Bowie. His home's in Bowie. He's a rental. He has his houses he rents in Bowie. He's a Bowie civic activist. I mean, he's extremely active in the governmental community affairs of the city of Bowie.
Right.
And he views this, and I've seen no evidence to the contrary, he views this as an attempt basically to muzzle him because, you know, when he wrote a firebrand email, you know, someone seized on that as an opportunity to try to use the peace order statute.
What does firebrand mean?
Well, firebrand, you know, he went over the top. He's incendiary. I mean, the way his figurative
inciting people to emotion.
His figurative speech
annoying.
is annoying. I don't think anybody could not. If you're the subject to this, you'd be annoyed. I'd be annoyed if he said I ought to be fired and I was making $196,000 a year. That would annoy me no end. You know, because that's my job, that's my livelihood, that's how I feed my family. So he has every right to be annoyed, no question. You know, but the issue is, under the Constitution, I think you have the right to say that. I think you have the right to be rude. You know, I'm not saying that people should be rude. You know, there was that attorney grievance case a couple of years ago where the lawyer referred to somebody at the MVA as Sparky. They brought him up on charges. And the Court of Appeals said, we're not 100% sure what Sparky means, but he has a free speech right, and at this point we don't think he crossed lines. You know, people can be rude, even lawyers.
Well, if Mr. Doms had called Mr. Deutsch Sparky, we wouldn't be here.
Right.
Ms. Levin, let me hear from you.
Thank you, Your Honor. We're recovering the same ground. Mr. Doms has a right to engage in political speech, and he has been engaging in political speech for years. As Mr. Deutsch will testify, these emails that you have in front of you are only a small portion of the stream of invective that has been aimed by Mr. Doms and Mr. Deutsch at the mayor, at a whole bunch of other, and Mr. Rouse, and a whole bunch of other people.
Who's Mr. Rouse?
Mr. Rouse is the former editor of the Bowie Blade.
Ah. Okay.
And I won't go into the basis of that dispute, but I'm just saying nobody is seeking to stop Mr. Doms from engaging in political speech. If that was what we were about, we would have been here 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. We're not. Mr. Deutsch has been dealing with Mr. Doms by ignoring him. The problem is ignoring him because of who he is and because of his history, which includes mental illness, seems to only make Mr.
We're just chatting, Mr. Carey.
I understand.
Seems only to make Mr. Doms angrier, and that is exactly why, as a consequence of Mr. Deutsch ignoring Mr. Doms' political speech, Mr. Doms started threatening Mr. Deutsch with street justice. In context that you'll see in the emails is perfectly clear he means a fist fight last summer. We ignored that. We only came here with this last email, which clearly, as Mr. Carey acknowledges, rises to a different level. And he rises to a different level that is a threat of physical violence. And you do not have, excuse me, a First Amendment right to put other people in fear of imminent bodily harm. You don't have a First Amendment right to harass people outside of the scope of political speech. The paragraph that we're talking about is excisable from the rest. Mr. Doms could easily have made the point that he makes in that email, and the email before that, and the email before that, and the email before that, going back for the last 2.5 years, without making threats of physical violence. Your Honor may recall that this is an individual who has on occasion engaged in physical face-to-face confrontation, again arising out of the same political speech Your Honor, entered a peace order against Mr. Doms for the same sort of conduct. So Mr. Deutsch has a reasonable understanding that this is within the scope of reasonable activity to expect from Mr. Doms. This is not a situation like Mr. Carey described with the Nazis marching in Skokie. If the Nazis had marched down the main street of Skokie and stopped in front of Mr. Goldstein's store and said, "We'd like to go in and cut off Mr. Goldstein's nuts," that would not have been what was addressed by the Supreme Court in that case. I may be the only Jew in this courtroom, and I would stand up for the right of the Nazis to march down the streets of Skokie and exclaim their political philosophies. I believe in the First Amendment, but the First Amendment has limits, and Mr. Doms has crossed it. And to try and color the campaign of character assassination that has risen to the level of physical threats as being protected by the First Amendment is beyond what we should tolerate in a civilized society. This is not a question of obscenity. You don't have a First Amendment right to engage in obscenity when the obscenity involves a threat of physical harm against a specific individual. So all of the analogies that Mr. Carey is making in his argument are not applicable to what we have here. And what we have here is a person who is making a series of threats against an individual that reasonably place him in fear of imminent bodily harm. As he acknowledged, Mr. Doms lives in Bowie, he works in Bowie, he's within reasonable travel distance of City Hall. He was, in fact, in City Hall in the last 2 weeks for reasons that do not appear to be related to any necessary business of being there. Granted, it is a public building. The public has a right to be there. But when we're here on a peace order, the relevance of that is that it adds to the threat and the appearance of threat that we believe Mr. Doms is intentionally setting up against Mr. Deutsch. He wants Mr. Deutsch to know he can walk into City Hall whenever he feels like it. And that's unacceptable in the context of his threats. He's not an activist, he's a bully. That's what he is, and he wants you to allow him to continue to be a bully under cover of the First Amendment.
What do you want to see happen?
I would like Mr. Doms to be barred from making further threats against the city manager. I would like him to be barred from communicating with the city manager. If he has legitimate city business, I would like him to be directed to communicate with me, and I will communicate with the appropriate individual at City Hall. And I would like him to be ordered to stay away from City Hall unless he has permission in advance to be there, and I'd like him to stay away from the city manager's residence. And I should add that the staff at City Hall is also in fear because they are well aware of this communications, because as you can see, he sends it to every elected official he can get an email address. It's not a secret.
All right. Mr. Carey,
Judge.
can we fashion an agreement based on some or all of that request?
I would just tell you, just to deal with, when she says he was in City Hall the last 2 weeks without any business, he paid his Comcast bill, which you pay at City Hall if you want to go there, and he filed an application to be in the Bowie City Parade on the 6th of April. So, I don't know where Ms. Levin's getting her information concerning why my client was at City Hall, but he was there.
He's going to be in the parade?
He's filed an application to be in the parade. So he does do, business, with the city. He's not there to hang around. I mean, he's there for reasons, and those were the reasons that he was there in the last several days, within the last 2 weeks. If I could have a couple of minutes to discuss the court's question with my client, and I don't think it'll take very long.
Okay, before you do that, let me indicate to you sort of my preliminary thoughts.